All right, folks, welcome back. I'm going to be your chair for the second session of today's program. This panel basically discusses themes on environmental disasters from South Asia, and we have got three speakers lined up. Allow me to introduce you to your first speaker, Dr. Debojyoti Dash from the University of Sussex. Dr. Dash, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. For people who are joining from Canada, and it's like good evening for people who are joining from the Indian Ocean countries. So to begin with, I must say that I joined the Indian Ocean Appraisal Risk Summer School jointly organized by the Indian Ocean World Center and the McGill University and at the Center for World Environmental History for over 2 weeks, and I learned a lot from the workshop that was organized by the two centers. So before I start my presentation, I would like to share with you my
quickly.
Okay, thank you. So the devastating tropical cyclone that you know, Yash, that made landfall in Odisha and West Bengal yesterday has damaged large sections of the coastal embankments, both in India and Bangladesh. The cyclone was named Yash by the region's meteorological department, and the word is derived from a Persian vocabulary meaning disappointment. When I opened my Twitter page, I saw many tweets debating the use of the term. Some of the people from West Bengal, India and Bangladesh tweeted, why not name the cyclone as Hatasha, a Bengali translation for the same term. The use of the term Yash and the competing contest over its naming explains the trans-regional and transboundary connection of people and communities belonging to a place that connects region across the Indian Ocean world through disasters such as cyclones. The phrase monsoon Asia has long been used as a geographical allegory to identify a region that connects to the contemporary discourse on climate change and global warming. While natural disasters such as cyclones have been studied from multiple lenses in the Indian Ocean region, I will suggest the historical studies of the Indian Ocean have evolved, focusing on three key synoptic visions that you can see in the screen. So for the first is how the Indian Ocean studies, as I see, has evolved over the years, is looking back, that is focused on migration and circulation history. For example, a long durée understanding of historical changes that have been shaped not only by contemporary globalization, but pre-colonial movement of people. The works of Ansang Ho, Sugato Bose, and Sunil Amrit speak about the trans-regional migration of goods, ideas, and commodities. Even before the arrival of the colonial powers, the region was global, established through maritime trade between South and Southeast Asia and East Africa. Now, going back to the question of looking back, discussions have been based on tracing genealogies. In the Sundarbans, there is a vast repository of family-owned Puthi manuscripts that focus not only on Brahminical text, but also subaltern myths, legends, and shamanic practices that take center stage in communities' oral history. For the literal communities, these legends and popular culture is itihas, or history that has shaped their relationship with the environment. For example, the legends of peers and fakirs, Islamic mystics who entered the region from West Asia, take center stage in communities kind of psychologically handling events like natural disasters such as floods and cyclone. For example, when people go into the sea, they tell this name Badar Badar. So it's in the following the Badar Peer, who is very popular in the Sundarban Delta. Also looking in, and that's kind of the contemporary period, focusing on the contemporary literature published in the last 70 years, post 1947, particularly in South Asia, by the immigrant settler population who migrated from places like Mednipur and Bangladesh, current day East Pakistan, to the Indian part of the Sundarban. Fisher folk and peasants who have come to inhabit the Sundarban Delta share their everyday experience and nostalgia in little magazines through popular theater performances and poetry recitation. I'll show you some examples of how these kind of activities play a very important role in shaping community memory, in kind of understanding their relationship with natural environment. Like, for example, here, one of my interlocutor, poet Mukundo Gayan, kind of showcases his memorization of the 2009 Ayla cyclone through this painting. And here we have also people like local communities very much getting involved in understanding environmental change by depicting it through their scroll paintings and their artwork. So these are just some of the examples that I have to share with you. Now, coming to this folklore, which is very popular in the Sundarban Delta, called Bonobibi's Johornama, the tale of the lady lady of the forest. And here I would like to draw on Bruno Latour's kind of idea of natural religion, where he talks about the convivial relationship that we need to develop in order to kind of overcome the kind of challenges posed in the era of Anthropocene. And we have seen kind of from the early 18th century, and even before that with the Enlightenment project, there has been a Cartesian division between nature and culture, and which man has been put above in the environment. And that has kind of brought about an imbalance in terms of understanding our relationship with more than human spaces in the natural environment. And Sundarban is one of the classic cases where we can kind of trace back to the genealogies of the Puthi literature and the manuscript tradition that we have in terms of orality as well as written literature. Now I'll come to the introduction of my paper. And I will kind of explain the case. Living in the Sundarban Delta, as many would say, is like walking on the edge of a knife. The Sundarban is also known as Atharo Bhatir Desh, or the land of 18 tides. The ebbs and flow of life in the Delta are regulated by the transitory water regime. The Bengal Delta is home to nearly 250 million people spread across India and Bangladesh, and the amphibious landscape is famous for its distinct mangrove forest ecosystem that supports biodiversity and protects island population from tropical cyclone. This hybrid landscape, where the waters of three mighty rivers, the Ganges, Padma, and the Brahmaputra meet to form the world's largest bird-footed delta, is ecologically fragile and exposed to hydrohazards such as tropical cyclones, floods, and riverbank erosion. The delta is part of a biodiversity hotspot, megafauna, that connects the region with the wider littoral world. The interconnectedness and coexistence of human communities and culture produce diverse landscape, which can well be compared with the diversity of human geography and the notion of the ecotone in ecology. In the recent past, the concept of ecotone has found a wide range of application. For example, from the world of environmental studies or landscape geography to the broad space of human geography. For cultural geographers and environmental anthropologists who have seen the ontological turn in social anthropology since the early 1990s, the emphasis on more than human entities or multi-species ethnography present a pluralistic understanding of the relationship between nature and culture. Sundarban Delta presents a cultural ecotone where the meeting of different social groups, races, communities, and belief systems have produced a hybrid social space reflected in people's everyday practice, such as the worship of the Bonobi, the Lady of the Forest, who belongs to the vernacular liturgical tradition, but also symbolizes the concord between Hindu and Muslim pantheons in the island. As Neil Green, the historian of Indian Ocean world, opines, the work of Richard Eton on Bengal offers exciting possibilities to deconstruct the old paradigm of Islam as a monolithic world religion and Hinduism as Sanskritized artifact of Indological tradition. The Bengal Delta, with its unique geography and ecotonic transition, has historically played the role of a passageway for trans-regional diffusion of cultures and beliefs that have produced hybrids. Here, hard borders, boundaries are absent and do not define social identities. Rather, identities are co-produced by the liminal nature of the delta's edges that is malleable and even ever-changing with rising tides, cyclones, and floods, and migration of people across the region. As Bruno Latour points out in his recent book titled Facing Gig, environmentally impactful behavior is not simply a function of technological and economic interest, but are also shaped by ethical and religious framework. This he defines as natural religion, to alter our understanding of nature in order to survive the Anthropocene. Novelist Amitabh Ghosh, in his recent novels and non-fiction writing, similarly talks about the role of local folklore, myths, and legends of Sundarban Delta that can help us understand the ethical life world of human and more than human agents in fragile and ever-changing landscape like Delta environment. If we examine, now coming to the second section of my paper, Popular Literature of Sundarban and the Emergence of Ecotone, where I talk about the contested nature that emerged with the colonial intervention. If we examine the popular literature of Sundarban, we will come to realize that the stories had a great narrative style that captured the essence of an ecotone, where water played a defining role in shaping human interaction with the natural world as an active agent, facilitating mobility, migration, and circulation of commodities through trade and commerce. Amitabh Ghosh's novel Gun Island presents a awe-inspiring narrative of his central character, gun merchants or Banduki Shodagar, who the people, they circulate across the Bay of Bengal Delta during the 18th and 19th century through trade networks and are memorialized in Bengali ballads and rich folklore such as the Mongol Kabba. As Ghosh goes on to write, the Sundarbans are a frontier where commerce and the wilderness to look at each other directly in the eye. That's exactly where the war between profit and nature is fought, unquote. Ghosh shows how the gun merchant, mortal human beings, were acquiescent to local gods and goddesses as part of the moral ethics of care, who also embodied other more than human beings like Manasa Devi, goddess of serpent, Shitala Devi, goddess of disease, and the Pirs and Ghazis, Islamic spiritualists who came to settle in the region from Western Asia. The popular history of the Sundarban is embedded in communities' oral and social history. They speak of the hybridity of the landscape as imagined by local communities who depend not only on land, but also on the backwaters, forests, and swamps for their livelihood. The Cartesian logic used by colonial cartographers and administrators to separate land from water, reimagine the delta's ecotone as beautiful forest, has put a wool over the liminal nature of the delta, embedded in the long-held epigram, the land of 18 tides. This is because tides have historically played a more important role in enabling circulation of commodities, trade, and people across the region, with the land being transient place where travelers like the gun merchants stopped over to pay reverence to forest goddess for their successful venture into the sea and delta backwaters. With the expansion of colonial revenue settlement across the Bengal Delta, this relationship with the natural world was transformed with permanent settlement and land reclamation work that centralized the importance of land-based economic activity over water-based activities such as fishing, honey collection, and wax collection. It also change the meaning of waste. As for the colonial administrators, the land that could not be taxed for revenue purpose was a wasteland. As Anuj Elias observes, the land-based terrestrial peasant economy produced class and caste structures in colonial delta villages, while inside the forest, seafarers, fishers, and honey collectors maintained egalitarian structure and convivial relationship with one another. The deities they worshipped also lacked hierarchies, unlike in land-based economy. In fact, land-based peasant economy marshaled by the zamindari system, gentrified the population based on caste, class, religious, and occupational hierarchies in my study village. In the delta backwaters and forest landscape, the pluriversal idea of our access to resources prevailed. The material environment and resources were part of the commons, spirits, and jinns. The humans had a responsibility to share. Nothing was private, and any attempt to profit was fraught with retribution from the forest gods and literal spirits. The local ballads are rife with hymns that describe at great length reward and punishment for mortals in the delta. In the recent book, Witness to Marvel, Sufism and Literary Imagination, Tony Stewart weaves through these complexities where he presents stories as part of a historical text of events. Based on this evidence, the history of the Delta can be classified into one that emerged within the colonial context, that is land reclamation and revenue ethnography, and the other that emerged out of more than human interaction based on communities' belief system that were embedded in people's history and place making in the Delta. The colonial experience thus changed people's relationship with culture, nature, and place. During the course of my research, I looked at colonial records, missionary archives, and other local records. I did find a lot of records in the island pertaining to the 20th century in particular. And like most anthropologists, I also started talking to people and recording oral histories. Together, these efforts helped me identify two sets of documents. One document that speaks of the political and economic history of the region and the colonization of settlement in the islands, and the other rich place-based account that details relationship between early settlers and array of elements and beings of more than human histories. Some of the people dismiss these stories that involve modern human agents as nothing more than fairy tales or misconceptions. But local people do consider them as proper histories. And they're not only part of popular imagination, but they were complexly entangled, what I realized later, as I wanted to understand the relationship between them. For this, I turned into recent works on place-based ontologies and the ethical dimensions. For example, the relationship between land and forest that evolved over the colonial period, as opposed to popular imaginations as active agents in human affairs, such as the popular narrative based on the Pirs, Ghazis, and Bibis stories. In this context, I also find Iftikhar Iqbal's work on Bengal's riverine spaces and capitalist abstraction of property from the 18th century onwards useful. Therefore, when I refer to the term delta as third space and ecotone, I refer to the plurality of human-nature relationship in the Sundarban Delta that pushed the singular understanding of nature based on capitalist extraction or colonial governmentality into multitudes of understanding of the nature culture and entanglement, and as resembled through communities' oral, scribe history, and artifacts of material culture. Now, coming to the last section of my paper, colonial property rights in the Delta, fashioning hard borders and edges. The colonial period was a watershed of the Delta's history that swept the Delta's hybrid landscape under the carpet by promoting a false material consciousness of waste developed out of Locke's natural right by dividing land and water into units of quantifiable objects for economic use. The Cartesian dissociation of land from water was driven by revenue concerns of the Bengal presidency that resulted in control of the river and its flow. The Bengal Delta soon became the great environmental laboratory to test European theories on the purpose, use, and control of nature in all its manifestation. The annual floods became more prominent and disastrous, as well as riverbank erosion increased. Both the Permanent Settlement Act of 1793 and the Bengal Alluvium and Diluvium Act of 1825 established absolute and permanent land rights over fluid and transforming landscape, leading to the creation of artificial hard borders that were contested in the court of law by local landowners. In this process, the fluid and transient world of the Delta's waterscape became invisible as land became central to colonial capitalist and mercantile expropriation. In the Sundarban villages where I conducted fieldwork, the land was allocated as lots by the colonial administration, and revenue settlement plots were leased out by local zamindars, who were the local landlords, who reclaimed land through permanent settlement. Sir Daniel Hamilton was one such visionary Scotsman who bought 3 lots in the Sundarban island to start his cooperative experiment. When the island was bought, it was divided into several segmented landmass with tidal creeks. Over time, these tidal creeks have been reclaimed by the people, and they have become one landmass called Goshaba. The local cadastral map bears testimony to land reclamation work. These islands were settled roughly between 1920 and the 1940. However, the region has a much older history of settlement starting the 1900s, which is more towards the Bangladesh part of present-day Sundarban. The immigrants who reclaimed the land were originally from various parts of Bengal, particularly Mednipur. They came from Odisha and Chotanagpur Plateau and represented diverse landless peasantry, particularly Adivasis, Hindus and Muslims, and and were part of a mixed social geography. As I gleaned through the Hamilton Archive paper, I realized that the landed settlement in Sundarbans were embedded in hierarchies of land and political economy. This was reflected in the number of petitions and court cases that were filed based on exploitative land relation and disputes that emerged on boundaries and rent. Elderly villagers whom I interviewed, like poet Mukunda Gan, remembered how the zamindari was exploitative despite Hamilton's best effort and vision for creating a free society based on cooperative livelihood. In contrast to the hierarchies and exploitation that marked narratives of land reclamation, the Sundarban waterscape, its ponds, mangrove forests, river bodies, and tidal creeks emerged as places of abundance as common property. The forest and backwaters with their abundant becks, honey, fish, and various other plants sustained people's livelihood and allowed free access in light of the exploitation over land. Local Lathials, who are also the big men of the Hamilton Zamindari, was deployed to tide guard the state boundaries and revenue interest of the state. Conversely, over time, the Zamindari was overburdened with litigation and court cases. The most famous of these cases that is still remembered in popular memory of village elders is the case of Father Mazrik. The case was filed against Sudhanshu Bhushan Majumdar, the state's long-serving de facto landlord cum manager. The petitioner filed the case against the state manager, who was accused by many tenants of exploiting their land by rapacious taxation and illegal revenue demand. The case ended with Father Mazrik being recalled from his duties by the Archbishop of Calcutta. The Hamilton estate manager also carried out their propaganda campaign to defend their action by publishing on the progress of good work in Gosaba using the missionary and scientific press. A series of leaflets titled the Gosaba Cooperative Bhandar was published in the Agricultural Society and by the Churches of North India Missionary Press, eulogizing the hard work done by the Zamindari in order to preserve the cooperative model of rural development initiated by Sir Daniel Hamilton. Besides Father Mazrik, there were other local Adivasi activists like Sevak Das and Gajan Maiti, who are also fondly remembered by elder villagers. The local whistleblowers led protest campaign against zamindars and later joined the Republican Socialist Party. They fought for the rights of the peasant villagers who were exploited by the zamindars. I saw an anonymous letter written to the editor of the Amrit Bajar Patrika, a national Bengali daily, where petitioners questioned the action of the zamindars while restoring their trust on the principle of Aminta's vision and philosophy for Kosaba. For the zamindar, the political unrest was caused by communist gangsters and troublemakers and were accused of defaming the good work done by the zamindar on the estate. This kind of boundary dispute that became common in the reclaimed and settled agricultural landscape of the delta were not present inside the forest and river bodies. This made me rethink the contrast between estuarian landscape and the settled revenue landscape. The materiality of water as uncooperative commodity that needed to be tamed was very glaring in the people's narrative. Jang Bahadur Rai, the son of the chief Lathial of the state, recollects in one of his interviews that during his childhood, when Daniel Hamilton used to visit the island, that is during the year between 1930 to 1940, with his cooks from Kolkata's Grand Hotel, a pond was built to source freshwater fish for him and his wife's entertainment. No villagers were from the adjoining servants' quarter were allowed to fish in the pond, and children from the rest of the village were even barred to enter the private fishery. For the colonial administration in Lower Bengal, land was easy to convert into assets, which could be taxed, measured, classified, and separated for revenue generation through permanent settlement, and landless tenants who tilled the land based on its productive capacity. While this was not possible with water bodies that have a liminal existence and constantly froze to transform the landscape. So until quite recently, deltas have been regarded as marginal. Island communities have been of secondary interest to historians and geographers. It is at this moment of ecological crisis that we are rediscovering margins as complex, fuzzy, and ephemeral landscape in delta's environment. So what I'm trying to conclude from my presentation is the vulnerability that we see with tropical cyclones and flooding, coastal flooding, has increased with colonial intervention. And if you look at the traditional knowledge of the local people who inhabit the delta landscape, they have had a convivial relationship with their environment based on their folklore, based on their traditional understanding of human environment relationship. And this was disrupted or ruptured with the colonial kind of land settlement policy and other kinds of infrastructural interventions, which I didn't discuss in this paper because of the paucity of time. And that needs to be looked into because we always look at the revenue history of a place. We look at the kind of, we look at other forms of history making, but we also need to look at the popular culture and the social history of a place in order to understand how environmental change has taken place over a period of time. In this context, over a period of 2 centuries. And it's kind of triggered by anthropogenic action. That is what I'm trying to reflect in my paper. And that has also kind of, in a way, intensified the impact of cyclones and floods on human communities. And because these areas were originally not inhabited permanently by people, but today they are permanently inhabited by people. And that is one of the reasons why the impact of disasters is more pronounced in delta landscape or coastal landscape. And they have become also the ground zero of climate change. If you take the lexicon of international organizations like the IPCC. Thank you. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Das, for sticking to the time. That was Dr. Debojyoti Das. We turn now to Mr. Ashesh Kumar Dhar, who's a doctoral researcher at the University of Hyderabad. Over to you, Mr. Dhar.
Thank you, Dr. Archisman. I first of all, excuse me for this fluctuating network that I'm facing here, staying in Kolkata. So if I need to kind of later maybe join from other devices, kindly excuse me. A very good morning to all those from Canada, and a good evening to all those joining from the Indian Ocean world, particularly India. Okay, my paper is titled Devastation and Dominion, Reading a Terrain in Natural Disasters. The first part of my paper deals with the 1770 famine that wreaked havoc in the Bengal and Bihar region. And the second part of my paper deals with, albeit very briefly, with the 1934 earthquake, making comparisons and also looking at how historiography, certain historiographical literature have missed out on certain social engagements in the course of 160 years from 1770 to 1934. I hope I am audible.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Here in my paper, I seek to locate Purnia, which is a frontier bordering India, frontier which borders India and Nepal, situated in northeastern Bihar. Although when I talk of Purnia, I must clarify that its location in subsequent imperial maps throughout the 18th and 19th centuries saw changes owing to the recurring floods and administrative jugglery. I'm also aware that topographic entities like Purnia have undergone many structural changes on account of it being a natural ecological frontier entrained by forests, hills, and the Kosi River. Owing to its proximity with Nepal and it being a sub-Terai region, the ecological continuity is kind of inescapable. My intention to do a comparative study of the 1770 famine and the 1934 earthquake is an extension of my study on Purnia and Nepal as proximate political and ecological categories. In doing so, I understand the implications of comparing two very distinct disasters in scope and magnitude in two very distinct time zones. Both the disasters had ominous effects on the landscape of Bengal and Bihar, and it's important that we do a territorial study of natural disasters in order to situate it within the global histories of natural disasters. I argue that certain territories experience cycles of disaster and within them entrain rhythms of crisis, impacting the dependent population inhabiting the place and their everyday. Purnia suffered greatly throughout the famine of 1770 and also in the recurring floods because Kosi passes nearby, and famines of 19th century and the Great India-Nepal earthquake of 1934. The official estimates put comparative figures to show how Purnia suffered way less in comparison to districts like Muzaffarpur and Munger in 1934. The Bengal famine of 1769-70, popularly known as the Chihattoren Monnantar in Bengali prose, according to contemporary estimates and then of W. Hunters, swept away 1/3 of the population. It was a combination of the failure of the crops, also enhanced by a very, very late monsoon. By the time the monsoon arrived, it was too late, as granaries were infested with plague and a new epidemic was waiting to happen. Purnia was ominously ravaged by the famine. By the estimates of G.G. Dukarel, the collector of Purnia, who was the first collector of Purnia, British collector of Purnia, it swept away nearly half the people, the number of whom, not the quantity of lands, is acknowledged to constitute the wealth and real value of every country. It had also upset Dukarel's 3-year plan for the recovery of this region from the state of decay that had set in there since 1765, when the British were granted the Diwani rights. However, as historical literature on famine has potentially on Bengal famine has potentially argued, the British administration, coupled with their newfangled magistrate courts, sought to increase the revenue demand in all the districts, including Dinajpur and Purnia. In 1770 itself, Dukarel was petitioned by the local farmers to withdraw the newly augmented revenue provisions, or they would desert their lands and migrate to Nepal, a point raised by Vinita Damodran in her article on the comparative article on the Bengal famine and the Chota Nagpur famine. The proposition was not completely startling for Dukarel, as the locals, be it the farmers, the Nuniyas, who are the saltpeter makers, the Bagmars, or the people who were hired as tiger killers, or the timber cutters, had a history of easy passage to Nepal. On the other side, those who have stayed or forced to stay had to face the ignominy in death and see their families perish and their carcasses being pounced upon by the jackals, the hogs, or the dogs. The daily official report painted a gross visual image of the deaths. However, these grossly disturbing reports evoked the least of sympathies in the upper echelons. Hastings, the Governor General, ordered creation of peasant dependencies, where a farmer or a cultivator was to ensure that his neighbor doesn't desert the place, or he ran the risk of paying double revenue. In Purnia, nevertheless, the local administration was unable to check unprecedented desertion, and migration, and the result was many abandoned lands. The Committee of Circuit in Purnia in 1773 were looking in vain for local men to farm the vacant lands in lure of security. Now, Nepal, especially the Morang district, which is kind of adjacent to Purnia, was a haven for those escaping stringent laws in India, and it caught the peasants' imagination to escape the inevitable mortification in the wake of the famine. A disaster so devastating in effect also gave rise to a complex group of moneylenders who dealt in grain around local landed families and rich villagers who combined their activity with agriculture. In the course of commercial development, these groups increased their power during the disruption and desertion that followed the 1770 famine. Alongside, there was a rise in dacoity along the tracks of Dhaka, Rangpur, and Purnia. While historians like Vinita Damodaran and Vinay Bhushan Chaudhuri argue for the rise in dacoity and banditry in the immediate aftermath of the famine, in Purnia, it was a very everyday affair. The tracks along the Morang district and the jungle in and around Purnia provided convenient escape routes for the ravaging fakirs, who were considered as religious mendicants, and other group of Morang raiders, whom we later see acting as mercenaries or freebooters. The famine exacerbated the situation for the bureaucracy that was trying to find its foothold in the complex terrain. Some small landowners, and these are people whom we otherwise don't know, but these are people who are acting as mercenaries, who actually we find in the archives they are one of those mercenaries who otherwise, without their criminal records, wouldn't have found mention in the colonial archives. Small landowners like Purburam and Nanduram in Purnia, they stayed near places which were near to the hills. Purburam and Nanduram in Purnia, along places like Rangapani and Poakhali, turned to freebooting, acting as mercenaries for the Bhutias and the Gorkhas during the Sikkim War, in lieu of war booty, loot, and more land through grabbing. The famine, so devastating for a huge populace, was also a category, if I can call it, a category for profit and usury in the ever-changing decades of the late 18th century. Binoy Chaudhuri and John MacLean have forcefully argued that the famine must also be studied in its relation to social consequences. While MacLean discussed the zamindari and their kinship in Bardhaman and their changing relation with the peasantry in wake of the famine, Binoy Chaudhuri has incisively discussed the changing agrarian structure and peasantry in the aftermath of the famine. The Great Bengal Famine of 1769-70 was a disruptive force, affecting everyday mobilities and structures of power at many places. In Purnia, whereas the famine wiped out almost half of the population, its impact on the political operations, social engagements, by which I mean crossing onto the other side of the border, for timber cutting, for killing tigers, these didn't stop along the border, needs to be mapped out in a more durable aftermath. Now, comparisons are ambiguous, but are also an aid in researching natural disasters in various temporalities. An earthquake hit Nepal and its adjacent areas on 15th of January 1934. The tremors were felt in India and Nepal, and the tracts across Muzaffarpur, Darbhanga, Shahabad, Munger, and Purnia were kind of affected by this sudden earthquake. Muzaffarpur was the worst hit, and the official estimates put a minimum of 10,000 deaths across the border. Certainly, I'm not an expert on earthquake. I would just say that earthquakes are not randomly distributed on Earth and mostly occur on tectonic plate boundaries. The epicenter for the earthquake was located in eastern Nepal, and the places where the damages of life and property happened was from Purnia in the east to the Champaran in the west. In the relief report published in 1934, and I quote, "The eastern portion of North Bihar is less fertile and more sparsely populated than Tirhut. Much of it is occupied by the numerous branches of the Kosi River. The Purnia district occupies the extreme east. The only towns of any importance are Purnia and Katihar, and there are some small towns which are subdivisional headquarters at Supal, Araria, Kishanganj, Begusarai, and Madhepura." The relief report further goes on to add, in the worst areas, the shaking of the earth was so severe, the people couldn't stand up and were compelled to sit or lie on ground. One of the most spectacular results of the violent oscillation of the alluvial soil was the ejection of sand and water. Now, this ejection of sand and water was a sight to behold. It was reported massively throughout all the Times of India newspaper and all the relief reports, but it also found mention in one of the very short stories by Vibhuti Bhushan Mukhopadhyay known as Bhumikampo, the date of which sadly I can't kind of till now. It's a short story where this exact sight of sand and water coming out was mentioned. The compression of the soil caused it to open up into fissures, sometimes severely 100 yards in length, and from them poured several quantities of water heavily charged with fine sand. In a number of places, level ground on the edges broke away, and great slabs of earth sank as much as 10 feet below. The report pointed to authentic instances where human beings and animals were temporarily imprisoned in a closing fissure. In Purnia, the case was no different. Many buildings were left standing but tilted at angles. Mud huts and loosely built masonry buildings collapsed in large numbers. Wells were inundated and most sources of water supply were hindered. By their documentations and other records like the sanitary reports of 1908 establishes that there was a municipal governance now in place, but hordes of relief work in places like Muzaffarpur and Champaran and in some places of Darbhanga was carried on by local Congress leaders. Huge contributions poured in from the industrialists like Birla, like a person called I try and make sure I'm saying it correctly, Birla, who actually spent 2,000 rupees, sent 2,000 rupees to the Purnia collector. Now, a more modern network of corporate and governance was held by a more pronounced public sphere. Though the government feared looting in desolate towns, we have no evidence of it, and we can't with certainty say that there was any form of looting or raiding the granary. The interesting part is Purnia was officially estimated to have suffered 2 deaths, while the official estimates were being conjured up. Now, however, the most startling thing with the 1934 earthquake has been its very recent historiography. It's a very coming up historiography of 1934 earthquake, and there I think we need to deal more with the impact it had. Famously known as the Tagore-Gandhi controversy, Gandhi's belief that the earthquake was an outcome of the actions of the upper caste and hence must be considered as an act of God, Gandhi submitted that it was due to the maltreatment of the Harijans at the hands of the upper caste that the wrath has fallen on earth. Tagore was stunned by Gandhi's proposition and said that there is no place for such orthodoxy in a modern nation. Far removed from this debate that caught the nation's imaginations, places like Purnia were cut off from other districts. The wells had dried, and the Times of India report quoted Gandhi that Gandhi had the report of all the districts barring Purnia. Now, the reason of which it might be Rajendra Prasad's inability to go to Purnia, or Purnia being cut off, we are not sure. In the wake of the nationalist narrative around the earthquake and its subsequent historical literature, the macrocosm of death and loss, science and myth, rationality or superstition, there were incomprehensible damages beyond buildings and communications. None of the nationalist debate on the imperial reports pointed to the effects of inundation. In Purnia, there was a marked decrease in the area under jute cultivation owing to the deposit of sand following the earthquake. Now these are there were, of course, these are all land system changes and weather changes in the wake of the drying up of the areas, but in a span of 160 years and covering from the 1770 famine to the 1934 earthquake, we see a very gaping hole in the historiography of not locating the social engagements along the, as I already said, the borderlands and places where jute was being cultivated. It becomes a task to recover a region from the historiography of 1770. Now, famine, which I argue is a more structured study of agrarian distress than a history of natural disasters. So we don't have a proper kind of, if you can call it a proper monograph on the 1770 famine as such, and to then regionalize it, in terms of Purnia, Rangpur, Dhaka, becomes a more arduous task, because we are dealing with agrarian distress at a more structured level. The famine of 1770 is deeply entrenched with the agrarian historical literature on the period. It is more a commentary on the agrarian social structure, revenue, and agrarian social groups. To engage with global histories of natural disasters, we must be ready to also historically locate these distinct territories in their relation to their intimate ecologies, where the lives of the Nunias, like I already said, the saltpeter makers in the aftermath of the famine, or the daily mobilities of the timber cutter, was impacted along the border tracks. Territory is not a bounded concept. It's full of its own ambiguities and defined by practices. Did the famine act as a disruptive agent in the political ecology is where our concern lies. The consequential impact on the population is also a study in human settlements, where the settled lowly peasants suffered the most, whereas the impact on the cultivators proximate to the frontier or the borderland could migrate to Nepal easily. This also calls for a region-oriented study of the disaster in order to map out social ramifications of this ecological disaster, if you can call it. 1934 earthquake is a more complicated case historically, and this is why I say, because the kind of arguments we have come across from Sugato Bose to S.N. Mukherjee to the new historiography that is coming out, it's mostly dealing with the idea of rationality and idea of moral and science and what is pseudoscience regarding the 1934 earthquake. But I personally think that it has to talk more about the political economy and ecology, where jute can be considered as one of the main categories of argument of how did it impact jute. The 1934 earthquake found its place in popular culture in Vibhuti Bhushan Mukhopadhyay's, which I already mentioned, short story Bhumikampo, which becomes a critique of the elite rumor mongering self, where Calcutta-centric, the urban-centric elite is imagining destruction beyond, which is beyond anybody's kind of what should I say, imagination, and then comes to know that the earthquake didn't have that much impact, which the urban elite was imagining. And 1934 earthquake also finds another cultural representation in the form of Raj Kapoor's brilliant motion picture, came out in 1935, which is Inqilab, and which deals with the binary of the moral and the immoral, people who are practicing usury in the time of distress in the during the 1934 earthquake. This is what I intended to, all the while I was trying to connect these two and argue. I'll just say that the social engagements, the social communities, and people who work across the borders have been left out of these representations historically, and how 1934, both 1934 and 1770 famine, 1770 and 1934 earthquake have been studies as disruptive events. But I think we need to place the jute cultivators, the Nunias, the saltpeter makers, the Bagmars at the to understand how social communities were impacted by these two disasters, if you can call it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dhar. We move on now to the last speaker of this session, Mr. Archit Guha. Over to you, Mr. Guha.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to the Indian Ocean World Center for organizing this session. And I've enjoyed all the presentations so far and look forward to the ones coming up today and tomorrow. I'm just going to start sharing my screen, and just give me a minute. Can everyone see that? All right, so to begin, I begin with an image that on the surface has little to do with the substance of what I'm going to discuss through the course of my presentation, but I think bears some significance for the issues I'm contending with. This painting, The Angelus Novus, The New Angel, is by the 20th century Swiss-German artist Paul Klee, and was made important for the study of history by Walter Benjamin in his thesis on the philosophy of history, published posthumously and written in the politically charged atmosphere of the Second World War. For Benjamin, this was the angel of history, whose face is turned to the past, where, as Benjamin put it, the angel saw only catastrophe or a pile of debris, while others saw simply a chain of events. The angel wants to awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed, but is propelled by what lies behind, a storm, which Benjamin calls the force of the future. How do we think about the storm in writing histories of our present predicament? One powerful generative idea has been that of the Anthropocene, or more bluntly, humans as a geological force in the epoch of anthropogenic climate change. In Dipesh Chakraborty's more recent theses, he poses the fundamental transformation of the historical writing of the present as one that has to collapse the age-old divide between human and natural histories. I take that invitation seriously in thinking about how human and natural collide in the context of colonial capitalism, more specifically by tracing the origins of the term cyclone that emerged as a scientific concept in 19th century South Asia, which shows how a science of the storm that predated formal meteorology began to offer warnings about extreme weather crises in the region. In any given year, the world experiences about 80 cyclones of varying intensities. We just had 2 over the past 2 weeks in South Asia alone. While we live in a moment of unprecedented erratic weather patterns wrought by climate change, the advancement of meteorological technologies has stabilized the forecasting of these phenomena to a large extent. 150 years ago, however, the cyclone was still a fuzzy concept that was fighting for recognition in the scientific imagination, both lexically and literally, as there was not as much clarity on how to classify and forecast storm-like events. In this period, British India also witnessed several cyclones, including one that led to the destruction of Port Canning, which was built in the marshy hinterland surrounding Calcutta in 1867. River Matla had experienced a storm surge and flooded over. The progenitor of the term cyclone, Henry Piddington, had warned the Governor General of India that the risk of a storm surge would be an insurmountable force to reckon with were Port Canning to be built. Piddington, as one of the protagonists in Amitav Ghosh's novel The Hungry Tide puts it, was a, quote, lowly shipping inspector, an English shire, or an English gentleman, who had fallen in love not with a woman nor even with a dog, as is often the case with lonely Englishmen living in faraway places, but with storms. He read them, listened to them, studied them, and tried to understand them. He loved them so much, he even coined a term for them, the cyclone, end quote. Ghosh, through his fictive world, has been one of the best chroniclers of Piddington, whom he has referred to as, quote, one of the first Cassandras of climate science in his more recent The Great Arrangement. I look at 2 interrelated moments of this love affair between Piddington and the cyclone that is so intimately intertwined with the politics of empire. First is Piddington's conception and development of an early science of the storm for practical use and his coining of the term cyclone in his magnum opus, The Sailor's Hornbook for the Law of Storms, published first in 1842 and revised over several subsequent editions. The second is a letter and report sent to the Governor General of India in 1853, where Piddington makes his claims on the limits of territorial expansion in the face of the cyclone more explicitly political. Piddington's knowledge production sets up a paradox, as you can see in the epigraph in the 2 texts that I present here, On the one hand, he was sanguine about the scientific study of storms, leading one to, as he put it, profit from the storms, as he described it in the Sailor's Hornbook. But on the other, he was deeply skeptical about and provided apocalyptic warnings about the development of Port Canning. Piddington's overall project was very much an exercise in Baconian science, and in doing so, he was engaged in what Deborah Cohen has heuristically called scaling, or working through apparent incommensurability. Scaling, as Cohen defines it, quote, attempts often contentiously, not always successfully, to situate the world in relation to times and places that are distant, intangible, or otherwise inaccessible to direct experience, end quote. She also adds that the process of scaling has cognitive, aesthetic, somatic, social, and affective dimensions, which will be important to keep in mind as we move forward in situating Piddington's scalar imagination in action. In later highlighting the limits of such knowledge and mastering the environment as he does in his letter to the Governor General, Piddington, I suggest, is pointing us towards a history of environmental disasters that were the result of the colonial state's failure to fully acknowledge the geographical and ecological limits of furthering projects backed by speculative capitalism. The grand vision for Port Canning was laid out by a private firm in Britain, the Port Canning Investment Company, which confidently took on the challenge of building a port to rival Calcutta in the marshy forested frontier of the Sundarbans that we were just exposed to in the first presentation. In an 1864 prospectus, the company proudly declared that Port Canning would not only solve the problems of docking that many ships along the imperial route faced in Calcutta, but would also yield agricultural profits that provide solid returns on investment. In this vision, there was little place for the risk and loss that Piddington had predicted were this port to be built. Juxtaposing then the imperial hubris of the investment company against Piddington's epistemic project allows us to analyze how extreme weather events like the cyclone were both studied and disregarded by various actors in the British Empire that often led to unmitigated crises. For Piddington, the main takeaway from the science of the storm was that it proved that storm-like winds revolve in a circular motion and are not right-lined like most ordinary winds. According to the prevailing nomenclature of the time, storms, gales, and hurricanes were also used to refer to straight winds. And to remedy that, Piddington coined the term cyclone from the Greek cyclos, which, as he puts it, signifies, among other things, quote, the coil of the snake, as neither affirming the circle to be a true one, though the circuit may be complete, yet expressing sufficiently the tendency to circular motion. End quote. The cyclone then semantically stands in to signify the directionality of the wind with greater precision, as Piddington states, a recognized English as well as a professional and scientific word is what the cyclone is. The choice to liken the cyclone to the coil of the snake may have been largely inadvertent, even though he did choose it over other meanings of the same Greek word. But when considered along with Piddington's portents of demonic tornadoes, we see that it allows for an instant affective response of fear. Another way of reading it is the possibility of charming the snake by avoiding or profiting from it, as Piddington puts it. The entire project in this Sailor's Hornbook was predicated on the ability to dispel that fear by scientifically studying and preparing for the cyclone, which these cards exemplify. These cards were essentially tools that were in the hands of sailors and captains of ships that were circuiting the Indian Ocean region during the period. And the use of these, as he explains in his own words, is quote, to lay down and move upon any part of a chart They may be supposed to represent a cyclone of 50 or 500 miles in diameter as we please, end quote. These transparent horn cards, as we see, fit classically into what John Tresh has called the Cosmogram, an instance of meaning-making via the material instantiation of an idea. The cyclone as a concept acquires meaning across different hemispheric scales that require Piddington and his hypothetical sailor to conjure the movement of these winds as part of a larger planetary pattern that can be scientifically recorded and studied, even if distant or inaccessible otherwise. Also, crucially, it provided a visual aesthetic to help exteriorize the process of tracking a cyclone. The fact that Piddington maintained much sanguinity about the predictive capacity to weather storms based on careful acquisition of scientific knowledge and data put into practice makes his unease and warnings about the building of Port Canning even more significant. Why was he so against the idea of the port if his study of the cyclone rendered such occurrences more predictable? In September of 1853, Piddington wrote a letter with a report of his findings on the viability of Port Canning in the marshy Sundarbans to the then Governor General of India, James Andrew. Piddington was immediately dismissive of the idea, stating that, quote, if in the approaching month of October, we are unfortunately visited by a heavy cyclone, passing on a right track so as to occasion an inundation in the Sundarbans near Calcutta, my deductions may be tested by a great experiment performed for us by the hand of nature herself, end quote. The cyclone did not hit that year, but 14 years later and 5 years after the port was built in November of 1867. Besides its prescience, the memoir is significant as it combines Piddington's own work on storms with the historical record of the Portuguese traversing the Sundarbans in the 16th century, accounts from native and other European informants, and his own knowledge of the geological sciences that he'd acquired as part of the British Empire. He argues against the belief that the lack of significant mass of population in the Sundarbans is a result of pirate networks operating in the surrounding bay, as was commonly believed during the period. He suggests instead that it was the, quote, well-known geological fact of a subsidence of the land, which lowering its level has made it liable to the constant and destructive inundations, end quote. He also adds that, quote, geologists are well aware that there is no phenomenon more common or more constantly going on all over the world, or one which has more constantly been in activity from the remotest geological periods than the gradual or sudden upheaval and sinking of large and small extents of the land, end quote. So we see how he's linking the geological or terrestrial scale with the atmospheric and oceanic by making the case that the Sundarbans have been susceptible to cyclonic inundations over the long durée. The information he gathers from his native informants further complicate matters, where Piddington claims that according to the informant, quote, we found at 25 or 30 feet deep in a bed of freshwater shells, the cylinder of an unfinished native sugar mill, end quote. This makes Piddington suspect that in the deep time of the archaeological data he uncovered, Calcutta and Sundarbans, quote, may have been 40 feet below and then 20 feet above their present level, or Hooghly and Calcutta may have been slowly rising while the Sundarbans sunk, end quote. The suspicions Piddington carries about the alternating rise and fall of the Sundarbans in Calcutta signal the wrestling with notions of deep time as a geological fact, contra the native knowledge and the attempts at making the two commensurable in a scientifically meaningful manner. He concludes by stating that, quote, everything and everyone must be prepared to see a day when, in the midst of the horrors of a hurricane, they will find a terrific mass of salt water rolling in or rising up on them with such rapidity that in a few minutes, the whole settlement will be inundated unless it be duly secured, end quote. Piddington Stone conveys a sense of climate-induced apocalyptic imagery that may not be new to us today, but points to a scalar imagination that was indeed being challenged and expanded in manifold directions in the 19th century. So we see the track of the cyclone that one of the Sundarbans cyclones prior to the one that happened in 1867, and I end with this illustration of Piddington, who was seen as a man of science in 19th century Bengal, writing about varied topics, cyclones of course, but a lot of other things. I've tried to show the ways through which Piddington and others in the British Empire tried to apprehend the cyclone in a period when there was a growing faith in human mastery of the environment through infrastructural interventions. In contending with what Ruskin called the vast machine sitting in Calcutta, this episode in history points us towards a nascent climate and meteorological science that originated in South Asia, and the struggles in defining what was and was not constructively possible in the face of destructive ecological forces at play. Set against the backdrop of the politics of empire, Piddington's love with the cyclone in a time of colonial capitalism in South Asia is a history of environmental crises in the region foretold. Thank you.
Thank you very much.